Hey, grade 9. Today we continue our discussion of biodiversity by talking about what causes this diversity, what causes the variation that we see in living things. So we're going to talk through, speciation for one and some of the processes. We're also going to talk about adaptations. Just talking about why we get all of the differences that we have in living things. So we're going to start off by talking about speciation. What speciation is the evolution of different species from a single ancestor. And in order for speciation to happen, we have to have separation of two different populations. So you have to have, a big population that then gets separated into two separate populations by some kind of barrier. Now that barrier could be as we're going to learn, like a physical barrier, or it could be a barrier in terms of something that has to do with behavior. There's lots of different options, but essentially they have to be separated in some kind of way. Then over time, those populations will genetically become further and further apart, right? So over time, and I've got a kitten here who's just kind of hanging out, chilling. Over time, those populations are going to get further and further apart as they become adapted to their specific set of circumstances. Variation is a result of the species adapting to suit the environment. And speciation takes a really long period of time, thousands to a million years. Like, it takes a long time for things to get so genetically separated that they're no longer the same species. And remember that our definition of the same species is that it's able to reproduce and have offspring that's viable. In other words, that offspring is also able to have offspring. Okay, so this is again brought about by different types of barriers. So geographic barriers is one option. This is a physical barrier that separates populations. So if I have a geographic barrier, like for example, I think here we have some mountains that separates the two different, oh no, they're just separated by a bunch of space. I think there's some mountains in there too, but by them being separated, even though they actually look quite similar, yes, they have a common ancestor, but over time they become more and more separate. So now they are two different species. There's another video here that we're going to watch. This is a really good one that kind of walks through speciation occurring for a bunch of different groups of lizard newt type things. So watch the video, linked in the Edpuzzle. Okay, now another way that we could have a barrier that causes speciation is by having what we call a biological barrier. So a biological barrier is like a process or something that isolates different populations. So for example, if you had mating calls, right? One mating call could separate a population because one group is attracted by that mating call and maybe another population has a different mating call that they're attracted to. So by having this difference in what they're attracted to for mating, we actually end up getting a barrier as a result. Dances or supremacy, when you have like a tier system within a population of a species, right? So I've even heard of things where like some groups of birds go to the top of the trees while other of the same species are always hanging out at the bottom of trees. And that actually ends up being this biological like barrier because they don't occupy the same space, and therefore as a result they're not mating. I mean, they're in the same area, there's no geographical barrier keeping the top and the bottom of the tree separate, but because of their behavior of where they naturally go and their niche, as a result we don't actually have them mating. So that's a biological barrier. It's something that they're not actually separated by space, but they're separated based on their behaviors and what they do that keeps them from mating and basically combining genetic information. Another option that can cause speciation and differences is genetic mutation. So if we have a mutation that actually ends up causing one group to be genetically different enough from another group, then that actually can be speciation as well. And so it would be genetic mutation happening over and over and over again, which might make one population incompatible with another population. And this picture right here is just of what's called a point mutation in DNA. So that's when all we've done is we've just essentially changed one single base pair in the DNA sequence. You'll learn about DNA later on. And then as a result, it could change the amino acid, which causes the protein to change, and so on. So yeah, let's watch this crash course video, really good one on speciation. Follow the link. Okay, so why don't you try out, before we move on, telling me what are the 3 different types of barriers we could have that could cause speciation to occur. Try it out. Now let's talk about adaptations. Definition of an adaptation, what it is an inherited structure or behavior that an organism may possess to increase its chance of surviving and reproducing. Now, when we talk an adaptation, the big thing is it has to be inherited. Okay, so it has to be something that can pass on to offspring. So in other words, it's held within genetic code. So for example, if you get a tattoo, that's not an adaptation. You just like a camouflage tattoo so you can hide in the bushes, right? That is not an adaptation because it's not going to pass on to your offspring. They're not going to have camouflage tattoos. So adaptations are things that are inherited and they can pass on from one generation to the next, and that it increases its chance of surviving and reproducing. As a species develops more adaptations, it becomes more biologically diverse. So you could have within a species some individuals having one adaptation and other individuals having different adaptations. So just having variety, right, within a species, within a population, means that we actually have adaptations, that some are more suited to the environment than others. So some other examples here of adaptations: sharp claws, loss of tail, camouflage, song of bird to attract mates, releasing pheromones. These are all things, adaptations, that increase the survival of the species. It allows them to survive. There's two types of adaptations. There's structural adaptations, which is an inherited physical characteristic that helps an organism survive in its environment. And then we have behavioral adaptations. Behavioral adaptations are inherited characteristics that help an organism survive in its environment that are behavioral. So it's how they act, right? So we kind of talked about that, for example, with the mating call, or possibly using different parts of a tree or whatever for birds. These are all behavioral adaptations. When we look at the polar bear, we actually have 4 different adaptations that are talked about here. I'll read them out. They're also in your notes. White fur helps them hide in plain sight. Large furry feet for walking on ice and snow. Muscle hump over shoulder for catching large prey. Most bears eat some plant matter, but where polar bears live, they have adapted to a totally carnivorous lifestyle. Okay, so of those 4 adaptations, I want you to identify which one is the behavioral adaptation. Okay, some other examples for us to kind of figure out, is it behavioral or structural? So let's take a look at this one right here. Whoa, sorry. The owl. An owl hunting at night is a blank adaptation to eliminate the competition with hawks that prey on the same food supply. Hawks hunt during the day, so owls hunt at night. So is that a behavioral or a structural adaptation? Try that now. Now, not to say that owls don't have structural adaptations to actually help them hunt at night. And if you take a look right now at that picture of the owl, I mean, you can actually see that, of course, its eyes are very adapted to hunting at night. Also, their ability to kind of echolocate, right? Or I guess that's more bats that do the echolocating, but their incredible hearing, their ear structure, right? Those kind of like holes on the side of their head. If you've ever seen an owl skull, it's crazy. That allows the sound to come in for them to locate their prey in the dark. Is quite incredible, and that would be structural adaptations. Here's another question. The rufous hummingbird's long beak is a blank adaptation to obtain nectar. Okay, so is it behavioral, structural? Go ahead. They migrate from Mexico to southern states, to northwestern states, southern Alberta. This is a blank adaptation. What is it? All right. Variability within a species, the genetic diversity it has helps a species survive when environmental changes occur. So all of these variations that happen for whatever reason, they help with survival. And we talked about the fact that genetic biodiversity is incredibly important to a species' survival. So when different stressors happen to a population, having variety in that population, having variation will allow it to survive. Because of that population, the ones that are most attuned, most adapted to weather that stress, to make it through, they will survive and they will pass on their genes. But we need to have that variation in order for there to be a population or a group that has the traits in order to be able to survive. So some examples of environmental changes that can happen. I mean, climate change is a big one right now. Introduction of a new predator. When you have introduced species and all of a sudden that introduced species is eating stuff that wasn't eaten before. Spread of a new disease. Introduction of a toxic substance into an environment. Elimination of a food source. All of these things could be issues that high variation, high genetic diversity will allow a species to overcome these stressors in order to strive and thrive. All right, variation is valuable because if one group of organisms runs into a problem, infection, pests, etc., there is another group that can fill its place. We've already talked about that. What's important for you to realize, though, is that adapting isn't like a active process for the animals. It's just either they have the traits to survive and reproduce or they do not. That's how this works. So when you take a look at an animal, right, and if it has the adaptations in order for it to survive a stress, well, then it's going to reproduce and pass on those genes, those adaptations to its offspring. If it doesn't have it, it dies and it doesn't pass on its genes. Nature is cruel. You've probably heard about the idea of like survival of the fittest, and that's what this is. That things that are adapted to their environment survive, things that aren't, don't. When you take a look at a lot of the species and animals that are going extinct, it's because they haven't adapted to the changes that are occurring. Right? They haven't adapted to a stress that has taken place. And we'll talk about that later on when we talk about like a generalist versus a specialist species. This comic, kind of funny, right? The idea that for this beaver is able to just kind of conjure up this adaptation of a chainsaw hand, which of course is not a thing. This isn't reality. Instead, either that beaver has the adaptations to be able to survive in its environment or it dies, and that's it. Okay, here's a video showing you some adaptations. So what are some factors that affect biodiversity and, lower it if it's there, it's causing issues? Well, urbanization and roads, right, involves destruction of habitat. Agriculture is the hugest reason for destruction of habitat. For example, taking a look at the palm industry and how horrible that is actually in South America, for example. Agriculture there. Pollution can cause issues, right? It's introducing toxic substances and changing conditions for organisms that they're unable to adapt to. Natural resources extraction, that again is destroying habitat, clearing things out to make room for taking the natural resources out of the ground or whatever. Tourism, recreation, that can be an issue that causes lowering in biodiversity, and non-native species. So introduced species coming in that normally haven't been within an ecosystem, and then they just wreak havoc on that ecosystem because they destroy or, let's say, feed on other organisms that weren't fed on before, and it completely disrupts the food chains, the food webs. So these are examples of things that can lower biodiversity. Now, the thing is we always have to balance stuff, right? So we need to realize that when we do things, when this kind of stuff happens, that there is a trade-off, and that biodiversity might get lower. There's impacts, which is why, for example, when new projects go forward for things like roads, urbanization, natural resource extraction, tourism, there's environmental studies to try to predict what the impacts will be of those actions, and then also to try to limit those impacts as much as possible so that it's not lowering the biodiversity as much as maybe it could if attention wasn't paid to those issues. All right, well, that's it. That's the end of our talk about biodiversity. If you would like, you can go ahead and watch a Bill Nye video on biodiversity. Just for kicks, I will share it. It's on YouTube, and you can watch through that as well. All right. Have a good rest of your day.